Hey everyone, welcome back to the Haunted Corner. I'm Ashton, and I am so happy to be back. I got super sick just before the 4th of July, and it took me down for almost 2 weeks. In the last episode, you can kind of hear my voice going, and yeah, I was down for the count for a while, but I'm back, and I'm ready to share a really tragic story with you all. Today, we're discussing the murder of an amazing couple. This is the story of Nancy and Richard Langert. There's a really good 48 Hours episode on this case called Road to Redemption, and the remainder of the sources that were used in this episode will be listed on the blog post. Let's get into it. This story begins with a young couple named Nancy and Richard Langert. Nancy was 25 years old at the time this case occurred. She was the youngest of 3 girls. They grew up in Winnetka, Illinois, a quiet suburb where Chicagoans would flock to raise their children. Those who knew Nancy described her as fun and highlighted her amazing sense of humor. No one had a bad thing to say about Nancy. She excelled in high school, but she was really excited to settle down and become a wife and a mother. In her early 20s, Nancy met a man named Richard Langert, and it was love at first sight. Richard was a tall, handsome jock, and he was perfect for Nancy. Nancy's family really loved Richard. They thought he was a great guy. On one occasion, Richard went out and mowed the family's lawn without being asked. He was just an all-around good guy. Nancy and Richard quickly fell in love and were married in 1987. They were working together at a coffee company at the time, and married life really suited them. Nancy was praying each and every month that she would get pregnant and that her dream to become a mom would finally come true. As 1990 approached, Nancy was ecstatic when she found out that she was expecting her first child with her husband, Richard. They were also building a house at the time, and they claimed that 1990 was going to be their year. While their new home was being built, Nancy and Richard were living in a townhouse that was owned by Nancy's parents. They were basically living out of a suitcase as they waited for the next step in their future, and life was good. On Saturday, April 7th, 1990, the family got together to celebrate Nancy's pregnancy news and her father Lee's birthday. They had a wonderful night together, and it was a very happy time in everyone's lives. There was so much to celebrate. At the end of the night, everyone said goodbye and went their separate ways, planning to see each other at church the next morning, and Nancy and Richard headed back to the townhouse to get some rest. The next morning, when Nancy and Richard didn't show up at church, the family immediately knew that something was wrong. Nancy's father, Lee, went over to the townhouse to see what was going on and why the couple didn't show up at church, but nothing could have prepared him for what he found when he arrived. As he entered the townhouse, Lee saw broken glass on the floor, and then he found Nancy's body lying at the bottom of the stairs. He then found Richard's body nearby, and he immediately called the police. Lee then called the rest of his family, including his daughter, Jean, who was singing in the church choir that Sunday, as she did every week. Richard was found with his hands handcuffed behind his back. He had been shot execution style and was killed instantly. Nancy was shot 3 times in her upper body, twice in her side, and once in her abdomen. Evidence at this scene showed that Nancy lived for a short time after being shot. She crawled over to her husband's body and drew a heart and the letter U in blood before she died. She was 2 months pregnant at the time. Police immediately jumped into action, trying to figure out who would want to hurt this loving couple. But this was no ordinary crime scene. This didn't appear to be a robbery. There was nothing taken from the scene. And even more puzzling, there was about $500 in cash strewn across the floor as if Nancy and Richard tried to give it to their attacker, but that wasn't what they were there for, possibly. So who would want to hurt Richard and Nancy? They were a happy couple with seemingly no enemies. So police were baffled. and a multi-town police task force was assembled in an attempt to solve the gruesome murders. What investigators gathered from the scene is that the intruder was able to gain access to the home through the back door after cutting out the glass with like a box cutter, and then they were able to escape undetected through the backyard. Behind the home, there was a bike trail that led basically all the way to Chicago, providing a quick escape. They also found a single glove near the back fence. But aside from that, there wasn't a lot to go on. Police looked into everything and everyone, including the family members. Rumors began to swirl of a possible drug connection within the coffee company that the couple was working for, but that was quickly ruled out. And then another rumor came to the forefront involving the IRA. The FBI had a theory that because Jean was involved in human rights work in Northern Ireland, the IRA thought it was a cover for her being in the CIA, and the IRA had mistaken Nancy for her sister Jean and killed her and Richard by mistake. The FBI claimed that there was a death threat from the IRA to Jean like several months earlier. But there were a few problems with this theory. According to Jean, no American has ever been killed in the Northern Irish conflict. The IRA typically publicly claims its killings, even when it's a mistake. And if anyone in Northern Ireland had wanted to kill Jean, it would have been a lot easier to do so when she was in Belfast, not that long before, like a week and a half before. So Jean wasn't as cooperative as the investigators had hoped, mainly because this theory was ridiculous. And they painted her, like the picture of her in the news, as not cooperating, which is ironic. They claim there are these death threats against her, and then they have her picture over the news. Like, great. That's great. Eventually, investigators moved away from the IRA theory when nothing panned out, and they were no closer to solving the murder of this innocent couple. Many feared that this case would go cold, but 6 months later, police caught a break. Winnetka Police Sergeant Patty McDonnell was on duty when two teenagers walked into the police station asking some very strange questions. The teenagers were Fu Hong, who was a senior at New Trier High School, and his girlfriend. And the two inquired about the Witness Protection Program. They claimed they knew who had committed the Langert murders. Fu said that his friend, David Bureau, had admitted to the murders. He claimed that David had a gun in his room, and he was afraid that David was going to kill again. Police in Winnetka were familiar with David, but weren't initially convinced that he could have committed the crime. That is, until Fu Hong gave them a detail that David had included in his version of events that wasn't released to the public. Fu said that David got nervous when he was talking to Nancy and Richard and had accidentally fired off a round, which appeared to be true. Police had found a bullet in the wall just above the baseboard, and at that time, Sergeant McDonnell knew that David was responsible for the murders of Nancy and Richard Langert, because this information had never been released to the public. The next day, David Bureau was arrested outside his home, and a search warrant was obtained for his room. Inside, officers found a gun underneath his bed, which was a stolen .357 Magnum and was confirmed to be the murder weapon. In addition, they found handcuffs similar to the ones that were found on Richard, as well as news articles about the murders. David insisted that he was only holding the gun for a friend. But he was charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder, intentional homicide of an unborn child, burglary, and home invasion. And he pleaded not guilty. Nancy's family was shocked to find out that the killer was a 16-year-old boy, and one that they knew. David was the son of a family friend. Apparently his father had worked for Lee at one point. The families even exchanged Christmas cards. But over time, the dark history of this teenager started to trickle out. This wasn't the first time David had been involved in violent behavior. He had previously shot a few people with a BB gun and apparently lit another person on fire. Not only that, but when he was 14 years old, he tried to poison his family by putting wood alcohol into the milk. His parents checked him into a psychiatric hospital for juveniles, but after less than 2 months, they let him come home against doctor's orders for continued treatment. They never attended any follow-up appointments. At the trial in the fall of 1991, David took the stand and stuck to his original story that he was holding the gun for a friend. Fortunately, no one bought his story, including the jury, who took just a few hours to find him guilty on all charges following the 2-week trial. David Bureau received 2 mandatory life sentences without the possibility of parole for the murders of Richard and Nancy. He also received a discretionary life sentence for the death of their unborn child. But the question remained, why? Why did he do it? And it would take 22 years to get the answer. Following the murders, both Jean and Jennifer Bishop, Nancy's sisters, they began work as outspoken advocates for gun control and against the death penalty by lobbying and speaking around the country about Nancy and Richard's story. And in an act of ultimate strength, the two have forgiven David for the murders of their sister and brother-in-law. Jean went on to become a public defender, and that is when she crossed paths with Mark Osler, a law professor whose mission is to seek reduced sentences and often clemency. And her interactions with him led her to reach out to David. Jean wrote to David and received a response, something that had been decades coming. And in his letter to Jean, David admitted to killing Nancy and Richard. He also claimed that he intended to rob the couple initially, but then he felt like he had to finish what he had started. And that was his reasoning for it. Jean has continued to visit David in prison and believes that he deserves a second chance. I just can't imagine the strength that takes someone to overcome that and be able to forgive. A 2012 U.S. Supreme Court ruling that said mandatory life sentences for juveniles violated the Constitution later led the Illinois Supreme Court to grant new sentencing hearings for any juveniles previously given those sentences. David has made multiple attempts previously to have his discretionary life sentence reconsidered, claiming that he should also be given a new sentencing hearing on the intentional homicide charge, arguing that the judge who sentenced him had not taken into account his age or the possibility for his rehabilitation. But in 2022, his petition was dismissed and he remains in prison. And that is the story of the murder of Nancy and Richard Langert. Thank you so much for tuning in today. I hope you enjoyed the episode, as horrific as it was. I cannot believe that this is episode 99 of the podcast, and next week is episode 100. Thank you to all of you who continued to listen and support the show. Thank you so much to my Patreon supporters who have been there from the beginning. I appreciate each and every one of you, and I'm excited for the next 100 episodes. So stay tuned. Next week, it's going to be a good one. If you're enjoying the podcast and would like to share your support, head over to Patreon. You can donate $1 a month. You can donate $5 a month. And you'll get some pretty sweet stuff, access to exclusive episodes, and it's pretty awesome. So head over there. The sources for today's episode will be listed on the blog post at thehauntedcorner.com, which is linked to in the show notes. Follow us on social media at The Haunted Corner on Instagram, Facebook, YouTube, and TikTok. Check out the new food blog if you haven't already. I'm posting new recipes every week for you all, so that's thehauntedfoodie.com. You can follow me on social media at thehauntedfoodie as well. And until next time, be kind and take care of yourselves, and we'll see you soon. Bye.